So let's dive right into Charlotte Temple and take up first its themes and its techniques, because I think that's one of the things that's most interesting about it. Now, again, I know it's really hard to read this because it's a couple hundred years old or more. It's quite a challenge. I realize that no one writes or speaks like this anymore. But you have to kind of wade through it a bit. If you need to go get a plot summary, that's fine. Please don't just read the plot summary, because there's an awful lot in the novel that nobody with a plot summary is going to be able to cover adequately. So some of the themes that we want to deal with, okay, that are easy to identify and pull out of here. I'm not going to do like a recap of everything that happens in the novel. We don't have that kind of time, and I don't have that kind of space on YouTube. But number one, the big theme, marriage and how to navigate social expectations, particularly for this class of woman. This is a novel that is geared towards a specific class of person. It's not for the general public. In fact, there's very little concept of the idea of a general public back then. Things were so stratified by class. The second thing, prudence. Prudence in one's behavior, prudence in one's decisions and choices. Prudence means doing something that's wise and something that is not foolhardy, taking care, considering, deliberating on what decision to make before making it. Then the third thing is on the duty and prescribed roles for young women, particularly of this particular class. And again, we're talking about not just working class, we're talking about generally upper class or upper middle class at the lowest. Someone who had means to put their child in private education, someone who would have means to marry them off to someone of equal status, those sorts of things. So in some cases, okay, so we do have this novel. You got Charlotte Temple, and you've got her friend, and you've got later on in life, that is, and you've got her tutor, Madame Leroux. By the way, what does Leroux mean in French? It means the street. She's a woman of the street, because that's exactly what she's like. You got Montreville and his sidekick Belcourt. So you got a female and her not so good influence. You got a male and his somewhat better influence. So they kind of mirror off on each other. You get a big digression early on about Charlotte's father, Mr. Temple, who, in marrying Charlotte's mother, Lucy, had to basically help her father, Lucy's father, Charlotte's grandfather, out of debtor's prison, right? And had to risk everything. Got a mortgage on his property and everything. His father, Charlotte's father, basically advised him to simply go and, it's on page 52 in my text, basically go and not marry Lucy, not bail Mr. Eldridge out of debtor's prison, but instead take up with a wealthy girl, Miss Weatherby. He says, "Then prithee, my dear lad, since your rank and fortune are so much beneath that of your princess, Lucy, might expect, be so kind as to turn your eyes on Miss Weatherby, who, having only an estate of 3,000 a year, that's £3,000, is more upon a level with you, and whose father yesterday solicited the mighty honor of your alliance. I shall leave you to consider on this offer, and I pray remember that your union with Miss Weatherby will put it in your power to be more liberally the friend of Lucy Eldridge." So Mr. Temple's father, this would be Charlotte's grandfather, says, "I want you to marry Miss Weatherby. Miss Weatherby's got a lot of money. Miss Weatherby her family fortune can really be a benefit to you, my son. 3,000 pounds, pound sterling. They called it a pound sterling because that's a pound of silver. 3,000 pounds of silver. Of course, there's 16 ounces in a pound. That's probably in today's dollars something on the order of $600,000 or $700,000 a year. Okay, I mean that's a lot of money there, because you know it's enough. Well, more like $750,000. That's her annual income off of her trust fund or whatever. In other words, she's been given that as a dowry. Now, this is really important because this is not the first time that someone in the novel tells a young man, don't marry for love, marry for money. And in this case, it's really cynical because what the old man tells Charlotte's father is, don't marry Lucy Eldridge, marry Miss Weatherby. She has an income of $750,000 a year. That's going to allow you to buy Lucy Eldridge some nice things. Implication, wink, wink, you can marry the girl with money keep the other girl you really like as your mistress and use the money from the woman you married to support your mistress. Isn't this sleazy, scummy? Well, all of this ties into a clash of dominant views that's presented in the novel, okay? Among the upper class and middle classes, and we're going to see this a lot because the issue of marriage is going to be really important to women writers throughout the next century or two. The issue of marriage, especially with this class of individual, upper and upper middle class, you didn't really often marry just for love. That was pretty uncommon. You married because two families wanted to unite together. You married because you wanted to have somebody who would be a suitable social and economic mate for you. It was almost like a business deal. It sounds cold to us because, of course, we're post-romantics. These were not romantics, but we're post-romantics. We marry for love, right? It doesn't matter if you got any money, baby. It's all about love. They would have said, that's insane. They would have said, that's what only lower-class, trashy people do, right? People who can't control their hormones. They would have said, this is nothing but lust and animalistic, passion. And instead, they would have said, if I have a daughter, I'm going to give her a substantial dowry. And I'm going to give her the right kind of education. We'll talk about that in the future as well. What was the right kind of education for these kinds of girls? Well, it wasn't a formal education at a university, I can tell you that. It would be things like singing and sewing and, playing piano and French, which they would never use with actual French people. Weird and kind of a waste. But you would give your daughter a dowry, you would give her that kind of education, you would introduce her to the right kind of people because you made business connections, social connections this way, and she would be in a better position of attracting a young man that would be from a quote, good family, end quote. And the dowry would help that. Now, as a man who didn't come from means, I would have liked a dowry. That would have been pretty good. My wife, unfortunately, didn't have one, but I love her anyway. And we've done fine even without the dowry. But a dowry would have come in handy, boy, I'll tell you what, in those first few years. Well, the dowry was a tradition, as many of you know, that's been around for a long, long time. Still exists in many cultures. But it served two functions. One, it allowed the young woman to attract a young man of the right stature. All of a sudden, girl walks into the room and you say, she's nice looking. Then you find out she's a millionaire. It's like, you know what? She's pretty hot. That kind of thing. And if daddy has a lot of money, daddy will put a big old price tag with his daughter. And, the attitude is, honey, I'm going to put such a big dowry, you can pick any boy you want kind of thing, right? The second thing, though, is that in many cases, much of that dowry, depending on the jurisdiction, remained hers. Or at least partly did. Now, that's not true everywhere. The laws were local, and they varied greatly. But for the most part, that dowry was something that went with the girl, but she controlled it. Now, that existed so that if your husband turns out to be a true schmuck, you're not left destitute, okay? But in some places, that dowry all went to him, so it just kind of depended. Anyway, what you had at the end of the 18th century was a view of marriage among the upper classes and the upper middle classes that marriage is for religion and procreation. Marriage was for economic well-being. Marriage was for biology, that is to have children, like I said, and also to help each other out in contentment. And the general attitude was, listen, if you're compatible, if you're from the same background, the same social class, the same religion, and if you're of the same means, you'll learn to love each other. Don't worry. You'll grow fond of each other. You'll become attracted. And besides, people will, eventually get, if you know what I mean, aroused enough that they'll, things will take its course, is a nice way of putting that. Okay? I guess if you're celibate long enough, you'll pretty much go, well, I'm married to this person, so I might as well. You wouldn't want your daughter to marry somebody she just didn't like, but for the most part, daughters tended to marry who their parents wanted them to, and figured, well, I mean, there are a lot of perks to being married, and people respectability and family and that kind of thing. And if he's not just absolutely horrible, maybe you can learn to like him, kind of thing. But along with this, what you're seeing in this novel is a real view of parents of these kinds of arrangements as being horrible. Look at what Montreville's father says on page 74 of the text as well. Parents don't come off very well in this novel, by the way. You can tell it's written for teenagers because all the parents are horrible, mean, and awful. Oh, gosh. Parents and grown-ups are so awful. I mean, this is who's reading it, okay? So, what you find out about Montreville's father is that he says that, he's smitten by Charlotte, but Charlotte has no money, right? Remember, Charlotte's father pretty much paid everything to get Eldridge out of debtor's prison, had enough left over to live in a cottage in the countryside, a very idyllic existence, but not a whole lot of money. So she's not going to have a dowry. She's very pretty, and she's not going to have a dowry. And Montreville's father says, listen, son, you're in the military, and you're drawing a military pay because you don't have a lot of money. And that's exactly what would happen, is that families who had maybe lost their fortune or didn't have a lot of money for the son to inherit, they would enlist the son into the military, and then once the son had attained a certain rank, he could support a family, but not until he'd made enough money, not until he'd risen in rank. And by rising in rank, that means way on up there. He says, he's talking about Charlotte Temple here and Montreville's attraction to her, and he says, but mark me, boy, if, on the contrary, you rush into a precipitate union with a girl of little or no fortune, take the poor creature from a comfortable home and kind friends, and plunge her into all the evils a narrow income and increasing family can inflict, I will leave you to enjoy the blessed fruits of your rashness. For by all that is sacred, neither my interest or fortune shall ever be exerted in your favor. I am serious. In other words, you marry a poor girl, you're getting nothing from me, pal. You take a poor girl and you say, well, I'm going to marry her anyway because I love her. Don't you expect any of my money? So the parents look terrible in this. But upper class people saw marriages as being sort of unions of maybe like a business interest, like a merger. They pressured their kids a lot. Roson's text, among other things, is really questioning whether or not this view of marriage is the right one. For the first time, really, in modern Western civilization among this class, people are beginning to say there should be something more than just a practical reason for marrying. People should be able to marry if they're in love with each other. People should be married based on their feelings for each other. And that's a really important point. Marriage gave status as well. When you finally read on page 102 here, and depending on your version, maybe it's a different page number, but on page 102, the narrator of the novel, which we'll get to in a moment, that's also very interesting, what the narrator's up to and trying to do here. The narrator of the novel basically talks about how, women who have been emotionally abandoned by their husbands, women whose husbands cheat on them and take mistresses. And by the way, when people didn't marry for love or attraction, it's not uncommon that they would take mistresses or cheat or engage in adultery. They didn't really have an emotional bond with their spouse to begin with. I mean, you're almost inviting temptation in that regard. It's kind of sad. And it was rampant. So the narrator basically says, look, if you're a woman and you're married to some guy who's cheating on you or who's very emotionally distant from you, it's a miserable existence. But you know what? It's not as bad as being his mistress. Because if you're his mistress, you have zero respect. Nobody pities you. But if you're a wife who's been emotionally or even physically or sexually abandoned by a husband who's a cheater or who's not interested, people at least can respect you and can have pity on you. This is what she says on 102. The wife whose breast glows with affection to her husband, and who in return meets only indifference, can but faintly conceive her anguish, meaning Charlotte's. Dreadfully painful is the situation of such a woman, but she has many comforts of which our poor Charlotte was deprived. The duteous, faithful wife, though treated with indifference, has one solid pleasure within her own bosom. She can reflect that she has not deserved neglect, that she has ever fulfilled the duties of her station with the strictest exactness. She may hope by constant assiduity and unremitted attention to recall her wanderer and be doubly happy in his returning affection. She knows he cannot leave her to unite himself to another. So, in other words, she has a couple of things going for her. Number one, she's got her own respect and dignity. She knows she's fulfilled her obligation to society, to her husband, to God. At least I didn't fail you. I can hold my head high and say I kept my end of the bargain. But she also says, as long as she doesn't leave him, he can't leave her. Why? Because there was really no divorce. None. And so that's why she says, the narrator says, she may hope, etc., and be doubly happy in his returning. She knows he cannot leave her to unite himself to another. He cannot cast her out to poverty and contempt. She looks around her and sees the smile of friendly welcome or the tear of affectionate consolation on the face of every person whom she favors with her esteem. And from all these circumstances she gathers comfort. But the poor girl, by thoughtless passion led astray, Charlotte, who in parting with her honor, her sexuality, has forfeited the esteem of the very man whom she has sacrificed every dear thing. This is a bad thing, right? You don't want to be a Charlotte, is what she's saying. Well, let's take a look at some of the other themes that continue on here, and then we'll do a third video. Prudence, benevolence, sentiment. It's called a sentimental seduction novel because part of it's supposed to be a tearjerker. Now, you and I might say, good gosh, this is so over the top that it's hard for me to cry about something like this. I would never cry something. But if you were 15 years old in 1790 something when this thing first came out, you would probably have a great cry. It would be very, oh, this poor girl, she's, oh no. And as you're reading this and he's sending her notes and she's sending him notes, you're all along, you're just on the edge of your seat going, oh no, don't meet with him. No, no, no. Oh, not alone in the garden. No, you never know what would happen, right? So you're emotionally invested in this, and the author is trying to do that. Why? The author wants you to cry. The author wants these 15-year-old girls to be moved because it's a sign of your humanity, of your compassion, that you're a good person, right? If you go to a tearjerker movie and you just sit there and laugh through it all, you're a pretty cold-hearted person, right? Well, that's the idea here. Now, you and I might not be terribly moved, and we won't have to go through all of these in the interest of time, but I've pointed out a few places where sentiment is highly praised in this, right? Sentiment, meaning having feeling. Don't be just some cold, callous, logical, calculating person like the parents in this novel. But, it's very important, but although you should have sentiment, right? Not be some cold, stone-hearted person. You should also, and you should have benevolence, which means you're moved by sentiment to act towards someone properly. You still need to be governed by prudence. Don't let your sentiments get the best of you. So that's one of the things that she's trying to do. Montraville is a fickle and immature person. He just flits from flower to flower. He's in love with her. He sees her for the first time, really not the first time, he'd seen her before, sees her for the first time as she's walking to or from church, I can't recall which, out in front of her house, and says, hubba hubba, that's a hottie. Now, you and I might say, oh my gosh, she's 15. But at the time, that was not terribly, terribly inappropriate, as we said earlier. Teenagers, why do you think we have Sweet 16 and quinceañera parties? What it's saying is it's a ritual, right? It's a cultural ritual that says, my daughter is now eligible for you to court her. Okay, that's what it means. It means she can now date, right? Now, a lot of these kids go out on dates, I guess, in preschool these days. I don't know. But, you know, people have Sweet 16 or quinceañera parties, and they're essentially advertising to the world, under certain conditions and with the proper supervision and with the proper ground rules, we are now saying to the world, our daughter is now eligible to be dated. Okay, so 15 is a key era. One of the things to realize, though, is that there's a whole philosophy being offered here. And what Rosen is trying to say with the interaction of these characters isn't just, oh, don't ever do anything. She is saying, follow your heart, but govern it carefully with prudence. So in a way, it is kind of acting as an advice book to young women, even though it's talking about stuff that good girls didn't talk about. You didn't talk about girls getting pregnant, okay? It's like, oh, the typical teenager during that time from this class would have known almost nothing about sex. They really would have. They would have known almost nothing. They would have been like small children. In fact, because kids, both boys and girls, went through puberty later then than they do now. I mean, boys are like shaving in kindergarten, I guess. I don't know what's good. Something's in the water. I don't know what it is. Anyway, they would have gone through puberty. It would not have been uncommon for girls at that age, 14 to still 13, 14 to still be playing with dolls. No kidding, because they went through puberty later. 15 is like just entering puberty kind of thing, or they're in puberty. I mean, puberty started later. Let's put it that way. So she's like straight out of the box here, and with very little knowledge, very innocent. He's a young man, few years certainly older than she is. He's in the military, but he hasn't worked his way up the rank. He's relatively new. The other thing is the duties and roles of young women. Her friend Beauchamp wants to reunite Charlotte Temple with her parents once things have fallen out. That's not going to happen. It's too late. But Beauchamp is the model of what you should do. You should marry someone who's appropriate, even if there's not a lot of passion to it, and you will grow to be fast friends and have a good relationship, and it will be affectionate, and your love for them will grow. You don't want to just jump out there and hug the neck of the first hot guy you see kind of thing. And on page 82, when she finally faints, it's important that they're emailing. Yeah, right. They had email then. They're messaging back and forth with each other, and she decides, I'm going to meet him just so I can tell him I can't meet him anymore. Right? Big mistake. If you're the reader, you're going, don't go. But she sees him, and he says, you're coming to America with me. Oh, no, I could never do. Yes, you're coming with me, and I love you, etc. And she faints, and he puts her in the coach, and they get on the boat, and off they go, and next thing you know, they're in New York. Okay. And then the next thing you know, she's pregnant. But it's important because she doesn't actually consent to going. He just picks her up after she faints. So there's a kind of a moral out here, right? If she just said, he said, you're hot, I want to take you as my mistress, and she were to fire back with something like, yeah, you're hot too, let's do it. The reader would say, oh, right? Readers are 15, 16 years old. They would say, no. They would lose sympathy with the main character. But if she faints, it's easy to say, oh, the poor thing. Yes, it's easy to faint when you're being overpowered by such a powerful, strong, and handsome young man. Her emotions got the best of her, right? So the danger isn't in her becoming a strumpet. The danger is in her losing control because she's such a weak vessel of her faculties and being just swept away, powerless at his machismo. You can't, girls, don't put yourself in that position. Don't ever do that, right? In the next and final installment of this lecture, sorry it's so long, but it's a novel after all, we'll go over the narrator and how interesting the narrator is and some of the other aspects.